So we are on a roll here. So I want to keep this going. So let's talk about understanding jump cuts. Now, like we learned before, this is when the difference between two cuts isn't enough and it's jarring or distracting for the viewer. And the reason that is because you need a certain amount of contrast between two different shots to create a clean cut. All of the cuts in our violinist video that we've been working on are all clean cuts. So you can kind of think of it as black text on a white screen. If the text is dark enough, there's going to be enough contrast for you to read the letters. If there isn't enough contrast between the black and white, there's not going to be enough for you to tell the difference between the two. So as you can see, I like metaphors. These things aren't to be taken literally, but it's just another way of looking at the same answer. And YouTube has really made jump cuts a lot more acceptable. But back in the day, I mean, when I came up in the filmmaking world, that was like a sin. If you had jump cuts in your video, no, 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 no. But the but the bottom line is that if you do it, you really want to do it with style and with purpose. So, like in our hype edit, we were doing jump cuts, cutting forward in time, and it worked. But if I were to create some jump cuts with this edit that we're working on, let's see what that would look like. So clearly, that's not going to be a stylistic decision that we're going to do purposefully. It does not work with the vibe and the overall aesthetic of this current project. And with that said, here's an example of the contrast between dark and light that I was talking about. Here we can easily see this wonderful quote from the homie Alan Watts. You are an aperture through which the universe is looking at and exploring itself. That's deep, baby. That's deep. But if we see the contrast between these two things disappearing, you then can't read the dang quote. There's not enough contrast between what's light in the frame and dark in the frame. Now, that's a metaphor. Let's look at a more practical example where not creating enough contrast to make a clean cut actually is used stylistically to make a cool looking edit. So as you can see, we have our character going into their car and we're jump cutting ahead in time. So this is working because it matches the vibe of this specific video. So just to recap this thought here, all of these cuts in this current project have enough change in each clip so that each shot has a clean change between one to the other. And if there wasn't enough change, let's say I did this, that would create a jump cut, which does not work with this project specifically. So add that one to your arsenal and remember to use your jump cuts consciously and creatively. And so you should be by now becoming a level 10, maybe not level 10 yet, but maybe level 8, level 9 editing ninja. So next up, now that we've gotten a really cool understanding, pacing, editing, shot choice, shot length, all these little intricacies and subtleties as an editor, we have these new things in our arsenal. What I want to do now for the rest of this learning lesson is to now hone in on some of the final refining steps that's really going to take this video and elevate it to a higher level of production. And so if we take a look here, I'm going to actually turn this down. This was all shot on a gimbal, but there's definitely a lot of noticeable shakiness and jerky motions and movements that I'm not super happy with and doesn't match the flowing tone of her performance. So, a really excellent and effective final polishing layer, once you get to the second draft edit, like we're at now, is to apply post-production stabilization. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to tell your software to analyze all the movements and shakes and wiggles and jostles, all those kind of verbs. It's going to analyze those and it's going to decide where movement is happening, and it's going to scale up your image and make a steadiness and really undo those motions. So if the camera moves this way, it's going to actually do the exact opposite movement, which cancels out the unwanted shakiness that we have in our footage. So let's go ahead and go to our first clip here. And I'm going to grab our warp stabilizer effect. This is what it's called in Premiere. In other editing softwares, it might be slightly different wording, but you want to grab your post-production stabilizing effect and drag it onto the first clip that we're editing with here. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to analyze the footage frame by frame, and when it's done analyzing, then it's going to scale up that image depending on how much movement is in the actual clip. The more movement, the more it needs to scale it up to combat that extra movement. And as you can see, our warp stabilizer has finished analyzing the clip. It's scaled up our clip from 100% to 102%, so just a little bit. And let's see what that looks like. So a lot smoother. If I undo the clip, you can see it goes back to 100% scale, and there's like that jitteriness. See the difference? The downside to this, when there's a lot of movement in the foreground and the background, the computer can't tell depth in your flat image. It can't tell that you were shooting in a three-dimensional area, where if I'm moving the camera here, this is in the foreground, that's you in the background. And it has a hard time knowing that there's a separation here. So for this clip in particular, we have this wobble and this kind of underwater look. So this is the effect and filter that you really want to fine tune. You really want to turn it down to the point where it's still stabilizing your footage, but on some shots, it has a really hard time knowing that this is in the foreground and this is in the background. So it's warping the whole clip as one big thing. So we're going to find a way to get around that. Once we get away from this tree, it looks pretty dang smooth compared to without the stabilization. There's all that extra shaking going on. So let's see what we can do to fine tune this clip so we're not getting this under the sea look here, okay? What you can do to minimize that warp is change the smoothness function. Every time you apply this filter to your clip, the automatic value is going to be 50% smoothness. This means how much you're applying the filter to the clip itself. Now let's turn this down to, let's say, 20%. Now it's going to reanalyze quickly and it's going to restabilize the clip. So now we're only scaling it up 101.9%. And let's hit play to see. Okay, that's looking better. There still is some definite unwanted warpiness. So we're going to have to bring it down even less. Let's say 10%. And the other thing that we can do is change the method at which this effect is analyzing our clip, okay? If we go from subspace warp, which is the default main method, it usually does a great job. But what I've noticed, when there's foreground in the clip in the background, subspace warp can get a little bit warpy. So we have perspective, position, scale, rotation, and position. Let's see what these other options do for us. So if we go to position and hit play, it's only going to be analyzing and moving your footage on a axis, an X and Y axis, the position, left, right, up, and down, okay? That we don't really want. I never use just the position method because it doesn't really do a whole lot to your clip. If we try the position, scale, and rotation method, it's now applying changes on the position, up, down, left, right, the scale, and the rotation. So it's adding more axes of change to better smoothen the image. So that's actually looking a lot better. And the last option, which is my favorite for this kind of scenario when we're not getting a very good stabilization on some tricky shots, I click perspective instead of subspace warp. Let's check that out. So that's starting to look pretty good. There's still a little bit of warp there just at this beginning, but I mean, we could fine tune it more, but I really want to move forward onto the other clips so we can continue this refining process. So let's check out the set of the next 3 shots. So there we've got a lot of shaking going on. This one is decent. There's not a whole lot of excess shaking. And that one is not too bad either. This one's definitely got some extra movements. So let's start with this first one. I'm going to apply this warp stabilizer to all of these clips. And now we're going to play through and see how good these clips work with the default settings of the stabilization. It's likely that we're going to have to do some fine tuning, which is very normal with this type of filter because every shot is different. There's different foreground, background, camera movement, contrast, where everything is different per shot. So it's not a one size fits all when it comes to this type of filter. Ooh, that's looking good. Okay, a little too much warping right there. So that looked so good. It's just right in here when we get a little bit too much. So let's see what it did for default. Of course, smoothness is always default set to 50%, and it only scaled up our image to 104, which is not bad. So, but let's bring this down to, let's say, 30%, and let's see if that gets rid of this excess. Okay, that looks great. Okay, there was still a little, it's subtle, but we don't want it to be obvious that there's stabilization. We want it to be seamless. And there's just these artifacts that show up of that underwater warpiness that makes it really obvious that everyone knows who knows that you are using a warp stabilizer. We don't want that. We want everything to look smooth and invisible in a way, not obvious that we applied a filter. So let's bring it down to 20 and let's hit play. Okay, I like that. Next shot looks pretty good. There's some extra bumping going on here. Okay, so let's bring this down to, let's say, 10% because there is a lot of movement in this one. The more movement, the more you have to bring down the smoothness because otherwise the stabilization that it does cancels out how good it looks because you go from shakiness to underwater and you don't want that. It looks pretty good at 10%, but as you can see, it kind of does a bounce with her movements, and we don't really want that. So let's try perspective on this one. And okay, we're still getting those movements. So let's drop it down even more to, let's say, 5%. Even more, 2%. Sometimes they even do 2 or 1%. And honestly, it's good enough. You don't need to take out all of the movement. You just want to take out the distracting little shakiness, okay? We don't need to really take away all of this movement with the camera, but it's just these actions that kills the professional look for your video. Perfect. So I've gone through and I fine-tuned the rest of these warp stabilizer filters. Now on a lot of these clips, as you can see, it's down to 1%, on a lot of them because for this specifically, there was a lot of movement going on. There was a lot of changing in the frame, close-ups, trees in the foreground, other things in the foreground. So it's really going to depend on the type of footage that you're working with. But now, before we wrap up this lesson, I want to see a side by side with the footage where we took the extra step and time in our second edit to add this fine tuned stabilization and see that next to our edit, which looked good, but until we see it side by side with one that's even more refined, you're going to see a big difference. Let's check that out. So you can see a lot of extra bouncing, a lot of extra shaking. So that extra 10 to 20 minutes that we spend on that step can literally add an extra 10 to 20% of production quality to our final edit. And that's with footage that was shot already on a gimbal. So you can really do even more with handheld footage and with other shots that need just a little bit of extra oomph to get to that level of professionalism that you're looking for. So in the next lecture, we're going to finish this project by adding our final step for this process, which is our final color correction layer. So we've made it to the final stage of our edit. And now that you're becoming an expert editor, can you guess what we're going to be doing in this stage? Hmm? Yes, we're going to be doing the color correction and color grading process because what we already have here looks pretty dang good. I mean, you can't really go wrong with shooting with a location like this and having a subject that's performing with a violin. I mean, that's pretty damn cool. But just like with the stabilization process, the little extra time that we're going to spend on this refinement is going to make the colors pop. It's going to make the imagery stand out a little bit more, and it's going to bring up the production value of our final product. So let's hop into the color correction and color grading process. All right, and so your timeline should be looking relatively similar to what we have here if you've been working on the violin footage, if you've been working on your own project with your own past footage. Be sure to have had your first edit done and your second refinement edit done, ideally with some post-production stabilization, and now your edit is ready to be stylized with some coloring. So to save time and really do this the right way, what we want to start by doing is first scrubbing through our footage and seeing any shots that stand out and don't match other shots. Instantly, I can see there's a pretty decent exposure difference in this transition from these two shots. So what I'm going to do is select the second shot, go to Effects, type in Lumetri Color, or type in whatever color filter title that your editing software uses. We're going to drop it on and we're going to hit up and we're going to we're going to open up the basic color correction panel. And what we're going to do here is we could drop the exposure, but you're going to see what that's going to do. It's almost going to drop the opacity, which here's the thing. This exposure is nice and this one is a little bit over. So rather than dropping the exposure, something you can do to drop down the overall intensity of light but create an even better looking image is to really bring the shadows down instead, because that's going to create more depth. There's going to be more, I don't know what other word to use besides depth in the shadows, but there's going to be more of a contrasty, stylized look by dropping the shadows, because you're just pushing down the dark parts of the frame. You're leaving the mids and you're leaving the bright parts of the frame to stand out, rather than bringing down the exposure, which is bringing down the darks, the mids, and the lights, right? The blacks, the mid-tone, and the white tone. I don't know if tone is the right word, but you know what I'm trying to say here. So we're just going to bring down the shadows just a touch so that these shots now are starting to match up a lot better. There's also a little bit of a color difference here. You can see there's a lot more tans going on in this image, and this one's feeling a bit more blue and cold, but it's not too bad. It's nice. We get the tans here once the shot pans around, but we could, if we wanted to, add a little bit of an increase in color temperature to bring up some more warmth in this shot. So that's the original. That's with the color temperature increase. We could do a little bit more. Let's do 10. Okay, perfect. So without, with, subtle, but you can see that that's a little bit more bluish and that's got some more tan in it, which is perfect when we want to match our shots. So that shot looks fine. Let's continue to scrub forward here. Now, this is a scenario when the exposure in the overall image is pretty good, but the way our subject is positioned and the way she's kind of backlit, and we don't have an external light over here out of frame. We don't have a fill card over here bouncing light onto her face. We didn't have that during the shooting process. Now, what we can do is, like I said, the overall exposure is great, but her exposure on her face is a little bit dark. So there's two ways we could do this. One way is to push up the shadows, because you can see this is all going to be affected by shadow parameters, okay? Because these are all darks, these are all lights, okay? So if I boost the highlights, that's really going to start bringing up the exposure on all the bright parts of the frame. We don't want to do that because the bright parts of the frame are already bright. What the problem is that the dark part of the frame, which happens to be her face in this shot, is a little on the dark side. So we can push that up and bring some more exposure to her face. Of course, it is going to affect the shadows in the rest of the shot, but it's perfect for focusing on her face for this shot particularly. So without and with, without and with. So that's a little bit better. That's one option, one way to do it. Now, the other option, I'm going to go ahead and turn this off, and I'm going to put on a new color correction layer so that we can see the difference between option 1 and option 2. Now, option 2 is to create a mask that is only affecting an area of our frame that we want it to affect. Now, there's 2 or 3 actual ways to do this. We have our ellipse mask, square mask, and our pen tool. If we click the ellipse mask, what this is going to do is it's going to add a circular mask to our image that's affecting where our color correction is going to affect our image. So if I turn this up, instantly we can see we're affecting the exposure only on this part of the frame, which is pretty cool. That's a really handy tool to have. Now, to blend our mask so there's not a hard edge and it's obvious that there's a mask there, we can feather the edges of our mask by changing the intensity of the mask feather. And we can change the opacity of that mask as well, which is going to also change the intensity of the mask's effect. And then we can change the expansion of how wide or narrow the mask is. And lastly, we can invert our mask. So we can actually affect the opposite of where the mask is. So let's go ahead and delete this. I'm going to click the mask, hit delete. And we can also do the square icon here to create a square mask. If there was something that we knew in the frame had right angles to it, we could do the square mask to kind of save time. We would be able to move the points of the frame of the mask around to match up our image. Of course, that's not the style of mask we're going to be doing in this situation. And lastly, if we really wanted to affect a very particular part of the frame that wasn't a square, wasn't a circle, and we wanted to take the time to really draw in our mask to make a very unique shape, we can use the pen tool and literally outline our subject by hand. Now you can get as complex or as detailed with this as you want. I'm going to change the zoom so that we zoom out a little bit and I have some room to select around the frame outside of the actual image to finish off the mask. And you can really fine tune this. You can move this around. You can also hold Alt to create curves instead of right angles, which is really great in a lot of situations, so that your mask looks a lot more organic with curves. And you can actually use these little lassos to even more fine tune where the mask is in your frame. So I'm going to scoot these out. Okay, we don't need this to curve here. Okay, I'm going to zoom back out here, fit it to the window, and turn the effect back on. And now we can see we're just affecting our subject. Now I'm going to turn the exposure down because this is definitely not the look we're going for. So I'm just going to turn it up a little bit and boost the shadows just a little bit, 10%. And now I'm going to feather out the edges so that it's not so obvious there's a mask there. You can see that's without the mask, that's with the mask. We're just adding a subtle little fill layer of light on our subject. And if we're happy with that, perfect. But to take it one step even further, we can actually keyframe the path and positioning of our mask frame by frame.